So today we are joined by Katie Giannakopoulos, who is going to be sharing about her experience in meteorology. She's currently a research associate studying coastal dynamics here at Gulf of Maine Research Institute in our climate center. And today she'll be discussing her career in meteorology, along with some of the career opportunities for people that are interested in that field, and a little bit about her research into sea level rise and climate change. So I'm very excited to hear from you, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Thank you all for joining today. I'm super excited to talk to you about the work that I do at GMRI, but also kind of more in general how I kind of got into the role that I'm in now, and some of the things you can do if you study meteorology. Um, so perfect. Zoe, can you see my screen? Perfect. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to start by talking a little bit about myself and how I got into the role that I'm in. So, my interest in the weather started when I was 8 years old, when I read a book about hurricanes in like second, third grade. And I thought it was so cool that something that was created by the atmosphere could cause so much damage. I was thought that was so crazy. And so ever since then, I've been really fascinated about all things weather, specifically hurricanes for a while, but definitely more of a broader interest now. What is actually hard to see in this photo, but is actually kind of neat, is I'm actually writing on a map. I'm tracking locations of a hurricane, and that's super cool to see that interest kind of start all the way back then. So, but from there, I always was pretty interested in the weather, and was able to incorporate the weather into all of our school projects and things. And so this photo here is my senior year of high school when I went out to the beach during a blizzard to take wind measurements. For a project I was doing. And so that passion definitely stayed with me all the way through high school. And then I graduated high school in 2018 and went halfway across the country to the University of Oklahoma, which is down here on the map. I'm originally from New Hampshire, so it was quite a long way. But I studied meteorology there for 4 years, which was so different than living in New England. I was able to see really strong thunderstorms, and I actually saw a tornado. And so that was so cool, but really loved my time there so much that I actually ended up staying another 2 years. And I studied more broadly, looking at the climate, which is more weather on a larger time scale, and looking at those kind of weather patterns over a long time scale. And so I graduated this past summer and joined GMRI as a research associate in August. So I'm pretty new to GMRI, so I'll touch on kind of the research I'm doing, but I'll talk kind of broadly about meteorology since I'm not super far into the work that I'm doing here yet. But this photo here is from work we did in the mudflats this past summer. So we went out into the mud. And we collected mud samples and took measurements of the elevation so we could see how the tide comes in. It was really cool, but very different from what I had done in the past. So I've had a lot of cool experiences beyond college. And so, first, broadly, I think it's important to kind of define what meteorology is. So, meteorology is the study of the atmosphere and its effect on the weather. So, when we talk about the different layers of the atmosphere, the layer we live in is down here in the troposphere. And generally, for reference, planes kind of fly in the lower stratosphere around the tropopause, which is kind of the in between the troposphere and the stratosphere. And so the weather is generally focused in this bottom layer, the troposphere, with some research kind of into the stratosphere. That's kind of where some clouds can be, and so kind of between the troposphere and the stratosphere. And so when we talk about meteorology, what phenomena does that include? So that can include rain, snow and ice, thunderstorms, hurricanes, tornadoes, dust storms. And I think something that I was really excited to see in the chat when you guys were discussing your favorite weather phenomenon was actually a nice sunny day. In this picture, even though it's not as intense as a hurricane or a tornado, there's still a lot of components of meteorology that go into what is making up these clouds. And that is just as important to understand as what is causing a hurricane or a tornado. So I was really excited to see that as well. And so when we talk about how meteorologists forecast the weather, there are a bunch of tools that we use. Generally, it's kind of hard to forecast the weather because you're essentially predicting the future, which is very hard to do. And so we use a bunch of different tools to kind of do this or get an idea of how the weather is going to look. And so we use first weather models, which are essentially when we put a bunch of math and physics into computers and say, this is how the atmosphere is supposed to develop. So based on what the weather looks like now, what will it look like a few days from now? And so when we look at these models, we get something like this. One thing that's important to note is that instead, when you're in an airplane and they tell you, you're 30,000 feet in the air, in meteorology, we use something slightly different than that. So we look at pressure instead of feet. So as you go up in the atmosphere, the pressure is going to decrease. And so we take different levels of these pressures to talk about what the atmosphere looks like. So this map here is 500 millibars, which millibars is what we measure pressure in, which is around 18,000 feet, if you compare that to feet. So a little bit lower than a typical airplane would fly. And so when we look at these, it looks pretty daunting, and I'm not going to go too much into it, but essentially what we're looking at is essentially sort of an atmospheric highway. And so if you have a car that starts up here, these bright colors are going to be your strongest winds. And all of the air that starts up here is going to follow this sort of highway. So essentially, your air particles will come down and then they will go back to the northeast before going off of the northeast coast. And so when we're looking to forecast the weather, you're looking for areas where you have really strong winds. And so we would expect storms to develop in this sort of area. And so that's one tool and a really important tool that we would use to start forecasting the weather. Then we also have satellite, which can show you what the current conditions are. So here you can see all of these layers of clouds in the white, and this is a really important tool to tell us where these clouds are and such. And so, but one downside to this is that satellite some imagery that comes out of satellite is only available during the day. When it's nighttime, the sun can't reflect off the clouds, which is what you're kind of seeing through satellite imagery. And so you can't get these kind of images during the nighttime. So that's a pretty big problem. So you have to use other tools to kind of fill that range. And so another tool that we use, which is really important, is observations and weather balloons. So oftentimes, every airport is going to have a weather station at it that's going to tell us what the current winds and the temperature and the humidity are. And those are all really important tools that we need to use and we need to compare, especially to our weather models. And so that's one way that we use observations, but also we have weather balloons, which are these in this bottom image here. That's a typical weather balloon. And down at the bottom, it has meteorology instruments. So it has a temperature sensor, a humidity sensor, which is like how much moisture is in the atmosphere. We have wind sensors. And so that is a really cool way that we can see what the atmosphere looks like from the ground all the way up into the sky. And so these are actually released twice a day from every location that has a star up in this map. And so when these balloons go up, you get some sort of map that looks like this. And this is actually from the National Weather Service office in Gray, Maine, so not too far from where we are in Portland at GMRI. Um, and these look very, very intense, but they're not too bad. So this red line is going to be what the temperature looks like. The green is going to be the dew point, which is where basically how moist the air is. We have the winds here. And so it can tell us a lot about what the atmosphere looks like from the ground up, which is a really cool tool to have. So we have all these tools, but what can you do as a job if you study meteorology? So there's a few different things you can do, and the first one is weather forecasting. So the first is for the National Weather Service, which is where I showed all those stars on the map in the last slide. And essentially what they do is they're going to tell you when there is a watch or a warning. So when you like today, if there was more snow, you'd probably get a winter weather advisory or a winter storm warning, which is all coming from the National Weather Service office. And ours in most of Maine and southern New Hampshire, or most of New Hampshire, are coming from the Weather Service in Gray. And they're also going to tell you what the weather is going to look like from today into the next week or so. So they are a really important job to keeping the public safe. Additionally, we have broadcast or being on TV telling the weather. So every day you go into work and you're in front of the camera telling people what the weather is going to be. That's another really important job that involves keeping the public safe, especially, when I lived in Oklahoma, there were tornadoes and things, and it was really important for people to be on TV telling everyone to where to go to be safe and if a tornado was coming. So another really important role in forecasting. And then additionally, there's forecasting you can do for other things. So this picture here is actually from the Southwest Airlines headquarters. So you can go and work for Southwest or any airline and tell pilots what the weather is going to be because you don't want to fly a plane into a storm or anything like that. So that's a really cool application of weather forecasting. So that's another thing you can do. Then, if you don't want to be a weather forecaster, you can research all of these different areas and weather phenomenon. So, first, you can study storms and tornadoes. So this is actually a photo of a project that my school was on. And so they drove, this is a radar on a truck here, and they drove them close to big thunderstorms and to get an idea of what it looks like in terms of winds and different meteorology variables around these big storms. And so this is a specific example of, a big supercell, which kind of causes these tornadoes. But you can also, take radar out to look at hurricanes and a bunch of other meteorology phenomena. So that's one area you can research. You can also fly planes into, I know I just said on the last slide, let's not fly planes into storms, but some, this is specifically the hurricane hunters, which I think are a part of the Air Force, and they fly planes into hurricanes to see what the pressure is and what the winds are like, to give forecasters an idea of the actual strength of the hurricane. And so that's a really cool job that you can do. Additionally, if you study clouds, they do a lot of flights into clouds. But yeah, super, super cool. Additionally, you can study hurricanes. So this is actually a big wave tank at the University of Miami. And what they do is they send different winds through the wave tank to see how big the waves get when things like hurricanes come and impact coastlines and things. So another super cool job and super cool research area. And then lastly, you can do modeling. So this is a 3D model of a tornado that's showing all of the different air that kind of gets absorbed into this tornado. Which is really cool, which this is a lot more, I think, more of a technical job. um, so definitely more like computer work to get this to run, but super cool application of research. And so lastly, if you aren't as interested in the first two, you can also work in what I call the applied sector. So this is going to be any job that really applies meteorology. So, for example, this is actually a company that looks at hail and winds on houses for insurance. But what they do is they put a house in this big simulator, and they put a bunch of hail in it and a bunch of really strong winds, and to see how it damages the roof or the structure of the house. So, another really interesting application of meteorology, but really important to know if you are working in this kind of industry, how weather is going to impact the structures. So really cool there. Then also, there are jobs where you can simulate these big storms. So if you have, a big hurricane that hits Miami, what is that going to do to the local area? So if there's a lot of flooding, like these areas in red are going to be really susceptible to a lot of flooding. And those are really important to know as well for planning, what where you're going to focus your resources and things. So another really cool job. And then lastly, we have outreach. So these are some of our great employees here at GMRI, and they are talking to the public about science and climate change and everything in between. So this is another great job if you want to share the science that's going on with the public, because we can do all the science, but if you guys don't know about it, then we're not doing a great job. So this is a super important part of the scientific process. And so that's kind of what you can do if you study meteorology. But now I'll kind of talk a little bit about the work I'm doing at GMRI and what that entails. So the inspiration for our project comes from these January 2024 storms. So not this past January, but the January before, we had two really big storms on January 10th, 2024 and January 13th, 2024 that caused a lot of flooding and damage on the coast of Maine. So here in this photo on the right, we have a ton of flooding that's coming into this lady's house, which you never want to see. And then on the bottom, we have a bunch of like a house that's in the water and a bunch of damage, probably from really strong waves. And so that's it's really important to know what's kind of causing these sorts of events because they do cause so much damage. And specifically, these two storms caused $90 million in damage. So that's pretty significant. But these storms, when they came to Maine, they had winds that were coming from the southeast, which is in this figure here in this black box. And so these are actually different from the storms that are usually talked about in the Northeast. If you pay attention to the weather, you've probably heard people talk about nor'easters, and what that really means is this sort of situation on the right image that I have here, where you have storms over the coast of Maine coming from the Northeast. Um, and so when you have that, your storm that's causing these winds is generally sitting off of the northeast coast. So here you kind of have the center of the storm. However, these storms that we had in January had winds from the southeast, which when those storms happen, the center of your storm is not off the coast. It's more inland. So over in this case, it was sitting over Vermont. And so these storms have different tracks that they follow. And so we want to understand through our project what is causing these tracks to be different. So then we know when we're going to have impacts like we did in January, or if we won't have as drastic impacts or different impacts with these nor'easters that we have. A super cool project that we're kind of just starting now, but we're really interested to see how that affects water level and waves and learn about how it affects the Gulf of Maine. Yeah, that's sort of a preview of what we're doing. But yeah, but with that, I'll stop there. And I'm happy to take any questions and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Katie. That was really interesting. I told you earlier that I'm very fascinated by meteorology and I wanted to be a meteorologist for a long time. So this was very cool to see. If anyone has any questions for Katie about the presentation or about meteorology in general, I'm sure we can answer some of those questions. So throw them into the chat and I'll read them off to her. And then in the meantime, I do have a couple of questions prepared and ready. So one is, what is your favorite part of your job, either here or just in general?
Yeah, I think. Oh, I would say I actually really enjoyed this part of my job. I really enjoy the outreach part. So I like being able to work with, really deep in the science, but I really enjoy being able to talk about what I'm doing and be able to see it have a direct impact into the Gulf of Maine and the community that relies on it. I think that's a really unique part of this job. And so yeah, that's definitely probably my favorite part.
Great. Okay, we do have a lot of questions actually. This is awesome.
Great.
Um, okay. One is from South Bristol School, and they're asking, why do clouds turn gray before they rain?
Ooh, that's a great question. So, I think there's a couple things that go into that. So, generally, as you're kind of getting more moisture within your cloud, it's going to be reflecting less of the sunlight. So, it's going to have like a darker color because it's not reflecting the sunlight. And the properties within the clouds are changing because it's about to rain. So, yeah, that's kind of a short answer of why they turn gray.
Very cool. Okay, next question is, how high can weather balloons go?
That's another great question. Weather balloons can go really high. They can go into the stratosphere, like really high into the stratosphere. So, yeah, they definitely kind of pop around then. But as they go up, they expand really wide. So, if you were all the way up in the stratosphere and saw them, they would be huge, which I think is a really funny fact that I just can't imagine seeing. But yeah, but they'll go up into the stratosphere.
Okay. One Another question we have is about those pilots that fly into storms. So I'm
Yeah.
kind of asking what type of college you would have to go to, and I'll expand it to like what sort of training would you need to be one of those pilots?
Yeah, you would have to have a degree in meteorology, or I think there's some with engineering backgrounds. I think a lot of times the meteorologists aren't flying the planes, so it's more of like a pilot who's flying the planes with a bunch of scientists on board, and the meteorologists will drop instruments into the storm. Um, yeah, so if you wanted to be a meteorologist, you would have to go to meteorology school. Um, getting like a 4-year degree in meteorology. But if you wanted to fly the plane, then that would be more of like a pilot's license, which is a different training set.
Cool. Okay, so they like kind of work together with
Yes.
different expertise. Very cool.
hmm
Okay, Corner Spring Montessori School is asking if there's ever been a tornado in Maine.
That's a great question that I would assume the answer is yes, but they are not very common. I know I grew up in New Hampshire and in my lifetime, we've had, I think, probably less than 10, and they're usually pretty weak because the storms that cause them are usually they set up differently in New England than they do in places where they get really strong tornadoes. So we have, I am assuming, but I probably very infrequently.
Yeah, I know Vermont had one like 8 years ago and is the first one like in a really, really long time. But if Vermont can have them, then in New Hampshire, then Maine probably too.
Yes, for sure.
Okay, Peaks Island School is asking, what's the worst storm you've experienced?
Ooh, that's a really good question. I would say when I was in Oklahoma, we had a storm that was coming towards us, and it was a really strong tornado, and we were all super nervous. And whenever people talk about tornadoes, they say that the sky looks green, and I'd never experienced that before. But this storm, the sky looked green, and it was so crazy. And we were all really nervous after that. But luckily, the storm ended up taking a turn, and so um, we made out okay in that storm. But that was definitely very scary. And it's crazy when the lightning is just flashing all around you, and there's just thunder nonstop. It's pretty wild. But that was the scariest one.
I can't imagine like the adrenaline buildup of that. That sounds really
Yes.
scary.
It is. And I think also, like living in New England, I had never heard tornado sirens before, but that is also scary because when storms are coming, the cities will set off the sirens that basically tell everyone to go inside. And those are really scary to hear. So when you hear those, you know it's getting scary.
Wow. Um, okay, Union Elementary School is asking, have you been a storm hunter before and looked for strong thunderstorms and or how close have you been to a tornado, like that type of storm?
Yes, I have been a storm chaser before. I went once when I was at school. I think being where the location of our school, one of the things about it was you didn't have to go that far in order to be in the really strong storms. And so a lot of the times I could stay at home and the storms would kind of come to me, which was nice to not have to be outside driving because there are a lot of dangers that are present when you're driving around these really big storms, especially if there's a lot of people going after these storms to try to get close to it. It's definitely there's a lot of danger. So I think I only went once because I was always too nervous, but we saw some pretty cool clouds. We didn't see a tornado like when we went out. When I saw a tornado, I was actually in our weather building and you could see it from the top floor, which was really cool. But I was safe, luckily. So I haven't been like super close to a tornado, but we've definitely been in some pretty strong thunderstorms. Just kind of the nature of living in the Southern Plains. So.
Cool. Um, from James H. Bean School, how do changing oceans affect our weather?
That's a really good question. And I think that's something that's particularly relevant in the Gulf of Maine because our ocean, the Gulf of Maine, is warming a lot faster than many of the world's oceans. Um, and so, um, and so, I think one thing that's really important is that when the ocean warms, there's a lot of interaction between the atmosphere and the ocean in general. And so when the oceans warm, they cause they allow more heat to go into the atmosphere. And what that does is that can affect how strong storms are because if they have more heat, they can strengthen. It also affects where they go. So if there's an area where, they can get more energy, they'll kind of track towards that. And so I think there's a lot of impacts of warming oceans. I think it's still also a big research area. So like the direct impacts are kind of still being researched as well. But those are a couple ways that the ocean can absolutely affect the atmosphere.
Very cool.
Mhm.
From Buxton Center Elementary School, they're asking, how would you predict the weather without technology? Like, is there a way to tell?
That's a really good question. I would say yeah, I mean, I would say if you have a lot of weather stations, you can tell. But I think and I think they did. Like they used to when if you have a simple windsock that can tell you like which way the wind is blowing. And so I think like there are definitely ways to do that. It's a lot harder. Um I think if you want to look like way far in advance, so if you want to know the weather a week from now without technology, you can't really do that, which has been a big benefit of having technology is being able to predict the weather a lot further out. Um, but it's definitely a lot harder to predict it without technology.
I've always been told that you can tell it's going to rain if the leaves on trees flip upside down. And it's
Yes.
definitely true sometimes. So you can keep your
Yes,
eye out for that.
absolutely.
Um, okay, there's a couple questions relating to the weather, like further into this season. So, is
Yeah.
there going to be more snow this year? Is there going to be more flooding this year? Those types of questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are hard questions to kind of answer, but I would say I would say we're probably past our peak snow for the season. But I wouldn't say that we won't get more snow. I think it's definitely possible, especially in New England, to get snow into March. So if you like snow, we'll probably get some more. I think there's a chance of snow this Saturday, I believe. But don't quote me on that. In terms of flooding, I'm sure we will. I think in in Portland especially, a normal high tide can cause flooding. And so I think definitely even just between the tides, those also will drive flooding in Portland. So and a bunch of like other coastal cities. So I would say, yeah, I think you can kind of expect more of those. To what extent? I'm not super sure, but definitely can expect some more probably this year.
Okay. We have a question from Winslow Junior High, which is which countries have the most tornadoes or hurricanes?
Yes, so we actually have the majority of tornadoes here in the US, in what we call Tornado Alley, which is the Great Plains. So it's going to be Oklahoma, it's going to be parts of Texas, Kansas, Nebraska. Those are kind of like the main states that have the majority of tornadoes. Also, kind of as you move to the Southeast US, they also have a lot of tornadoes. Not quite as many as Tornado Alley, but we definitely do. Um, yeah, I would say probably us in terms of tornadoes, but in terms of hurricanes, we definitely have them here. But also, I think the east coast of Asia has a lot of they call them typhoons when they are in the Pacific, but they have a lot of really really strong typhoons, and so they also have a lot of like pretty big storm events.
Very cool. Yeah, I always thought it was fascinating that we have so many tornadoes compared to other places, and they're always so much stronger, it seems, than the tornadoes in other places.
Yes, it has a lot to do with the topography of the US, so how the land is. So, where we have the Rocky Mountains, a lot of storms can develop kind of to the east of the Rocky Mountains, which sort of creates a prime setup, especially since the more of the western US is a lot drier. You need kind of that contrast of dry air versus we have really moist air from the Gulf of Mexico. So the way like our topography is set up, it allows for tornadoes.
We have a question from South Bristol School, which is, how do you tell what the weather is all around the world when you're just in one place?
Yes, this is a great question. I think there's a few answers to this. I think having local knowledge is really important. So, as much as, and I think that's something I'm realizing after moving back to New England. So, I'm very knowledgeable about how tornadoes form and things like that because I lived in Oklahoma. But blizzards are going to be very different from an atmospheric perspective than um, than than um, than Oklahoma. So like I think having local knowledge of people who live there, meteorologists who work there, is going to be really important. I think also weather models definitely help because they take into account a lot of those local differences. So it's weather models definitely help you kind of tell the weather in other places. But I think having a local knowledge of a meteorologist there, like there are companies that have offices in the US, they have offices in Japan, they have offices in Northern Europe, that are all going to be really important to helping understand the local weather. And, having mountains will affect the weather. And, I think having people that understand how those impacts, will affect the weather is really important. So I think kind of a combination of having weather models and things, but also having a local knowledge of the area is going to be really helpful in predicting weather around the world.
Yeah, very cool. It's great that we can all sort of communicate and work together on that. Uh,
Mhm.
so Piscataquis Community Secondary School is asking, how are fish and other animals affected by hurricanes, or it could be any weather as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, I would say I'm less knowledgeable on the impacts to like biological creatures. I think my work has more focused on like the atmosphere and its effect on like humans, I think, as opposed to like I'm less knowledgeable about what happens below the ocean surface. I would say that I know like pressure over the ocean will change as a result of hurricanes and, cyclones, extratropical cyclones, like when we have a snowstorm come through here, there's different pressure changes over the ocean. So I imagine those will affect probably where the fish are. But I don't specifically know exactly how they affect like fish. But if you want to know, I'm happy to find out for you.
Yeah, totally fair. I will take the opportunity to plug. We have another couple of scientists coming this spring who will be talking about amphibians and so like frogs and salamanders. and how climate change and potentially how weather are impacting their ability to grow and reproduce. So check out our website for those scientists. It'll be posted very soon. I'm very excited about it. But yeah, it's science expands beyond or over so much, so many topics. So can't be expected to know everything.
Yes.
Okay, we have time for probably one more question, and there are so many, but we had a question. Here we'll go. Okay. There was one question about if space can impact weather, like if it has anything to do with our weather. And I know that we just had some big like flares that caused those northern lights last fall and in the spring. So I guess if you could touch on that, it could be cool.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, definitely kind of what you see in the sky changes. So, like you said, the northern lights, that's such a cool thing that we have that we can see. And that has to do with the way that the light is scattering in the atmosphere, which is really, really cool. In terms of it affecting the weather, I know there's a lot of meteorology research into space weather and like storms that occur in space, which is really cool. I'm not as familiar with exactly how that's not really an area that I study, but if you're interested in space weather, I'm sure there's a bunch of things online related to it because I know there are a lot of people that do study that, which is really cool. So,
Yeah. Okay, and then one last question, which is
yeah.
what are you most excited about in your field right now?
That's a really good question. I think there's so much cool work being done in the field, that it's so hard to pick one. But hmm, I would say I would say I think is really cool is the opportunity that artificial intelligence has in meteorology and the fact that it can kind of learn about things in the atmosphere that like we as humans don't may not pick up on, which I think is really interesting. And like people are using like one of my friends actually is using artificial intelligence to predict where cold fronts and warm fronts are on with storms, which I think is such a cool application of meteorology. So I would say that's one area that I'm really interested in. I think selfishly, like I'm really interested in how oceans affect the atmosphere. And so I think like in my role here, I am really excited to dig into how the Gulf of Maine is affecting the atmosphere and the weather conditions in Maine. So I think like personally, that's what I'm really excited for in kind of like the overall meteorology field. I think I'm pretty interested to see how people use artificial intelligence and kind of its partner, which is called machine learning, in the science field. So
Very cool. I know AI, artificial intelligence, is being used in like so many different realms of science. Our next scientist is my friend Brooke Goodman. She uses AI to monitor wildlife populations by like using audio. So they record the
wow.
sounds and use AI to find what's there. It's fascinating how many applications it can have in
Yes, it's
science.
so cool. Hmm.
Yeah, well,
Absolutely.
yeah, well, thank you so much for talking to us. And thank you everyone for joining. I'm gonna stop recording and then I have like a fun way to say goodbye. So